Dr. Mustafa K Anuar. Mustafa is a long-time exco member and also the former honorary secretary of Aliran. He's former USM associate professor who has taught many who are now journalists in Malaysia. So I think some of the journalists he has taught are probably on this online forum as well, attending this forum. And he currently writes for an online news portal regularly. You might have seen his articles. Um, so to kick off the discussion, I just want to ask a couple of questions to Mustafa so that to frame his discussion. Um, so, Mus, do we really have media freedom and independence in Malaysia? And why, before that, why do you think media freedom is important in a democracy? And some people believe that the internet offers the ultimate hope for the people in terms of broadening the space for alternative views. But then are the voices of minorities heard as well? You know, the orang asal and migrants and women, do they actually have a space for their views as well? And to what extent does the internet provide space for the voiceless in society? So over to you, Moose.
Thank you, Anil. I suppose I will start by saying that media freedom has always been a burning issue for many people, particularly journalists, media activists, some academics, primarily because, as I said, over the years, it's quite a number of years, because the media landscape has changed over time, particularly with the advancement in the information and communication technology. So you'll see that over there you have new challenges and also opportunities to a certain extent. Yeah, and all this has become a concern for this particular group of people. Yeah? And I would say other concerned citizens as well. Secondly, why this is still a burning issue? Because media freedom develops, as we all know, not along a straight line, not linear, yeah? Not a linear development, but along the way you get hiccups, and sometimes what you have gained over the years get rolled back because of certain political conditions or because of a change of government. Yeah. So all this makes the people concerned to sit up and try to address this thing called media freedom. Yeah? Now, media freedom is not a constant. Yeah, it fluctuates, just as you can see that the media freedom ranking fluctuates from year to year, to show that there are forces that try to curb the freedom in a society. Yeah, and hence there's a need for, I suppose, many of us to be vigilant against any attempt to curb this freedom. Now, going to this thing called media freedom. For me, media freedom can be defined as a democratic space, a very important democratic space in which media operate. And hopefully with a larger media space, democratic space, the media could actually perform better as it has an important role to play in society. Yeah. Having said that, this is why this democratic space has to be jealously guarded against any attempt to constrain it, to curb it. Yeah. Now, how is it? How is it? I mean, how does this constraint happen? Well, basically through laws of the land. Yeah, in our case, as we all know, we have the certain laws that govern the media industry. For example, um, the Printing Presses and Publications Act, Sedition Act, and Communications and Multimedia Act. Yeah. Um, Now, apart from that, apart from laws, media ownership too is an important factor that could determine to some extent as how a media outlet operate. Yeah, and that's where the bias would come in. Bias that would be dictated largely by probably the owners themselves. Yeah. Um, so these are the constraints that will occur either by law or by media ownership. Yeah. Um, another way of constraint is that is the what you call self-censorship. Yeah. This normally happens when you have maybe a slew of laws that are considered as draconian, so much so that media workers get very uptight and overcautious, that they self-censor themselves. And to me, self-censorship is more sinister than the direct censorship, because after a while it takes a life of its own, take on the life of its own, without the government having to come in to intervene. Yeah. Now, why is media freedom is important in a democracy? As I intimated earlier, it has a role to play, a very important role to play, one of which is to ensure accountability and transparency on the part of the government, because in a democracy, we assume that the government should be accountable to the very people who voted them in. Yeah, and this is where media can play a role to make sure that what they do will be answerable. They are answerable to the people. Yeah. I suppose that's in a way is my in a way answer to your question, Anil, about media freedom. As regards whether there are groups who are still being marginalized, well, with the, as we all know, with the advancements in information technology, we have various media available, yeah, in society that can be used by people in general. But having said that, it doesn't mean that everything is fine. It doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily give us the impression that we have attained greater media freedom. Again, we are back to who owns it, yeah, and also the laws that govern the media industry. Now, before we have traditional media of newspapers, magazines, books, radio, TV, and cinema. Now, over time, especially with the advent of the internet, we have this so-called alternative media, which also include news portals. Yeah, but also over time, some news portals have taken the features of mainstream media, especially after it gets successful, and after a while it gets constrained by, I suppose, commercial interests and so on and so forth. We also have social media, as in the form of Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and of course WhatsApp and what have you, which gives you the impression that yes, individuals now do have the channels to express their views, yeah, but up to a point, I suppose, yeah. And also, we're talking about marginalized groups like the poor, the disadvantaged, the orang asal, Well, yeah, that's true. But this only applies to certain prominent figures, I suppose, yeah, whose voices through their megaphones attract the attention of the media. Not everyone gets the attention of the media. Yeah, again, there is the possibility of certain groups having the advantage over the others. Yeah. Um, I suppose I'll stop here for the time being. Anil, am I going beyond my time?
You're fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. It's great. So
I can chip in later on.
all right, that'll be good. So we'll have Q&A later. You can add in more.
Okay.
Our second speaker will be Himanshu. Himanshu is a veteran journalist and a news editor in the print and online media. And he's now executive editor of an online news portal. Older Penangites will remember his column, The Nutmeg Versus, on the social, environmental, political, and heritage issues of Penang. He's a Penang Heritage Council member, and he's also an accomplished actor when he's not being a journalist or editor. So Himanshu, to kick off the discussion from your side, just wondering, what's your do you really think there's more news freedom in the online news portals to report the news compared to the old conventional print media? And what kind of, if there is, what kind of impact will the emergency ordinance against fake news have on online media freedom? And apart from that, perhaps you could touch on the problem of ensuring financial sustainability for the online news portals, and how does it constrain the freedom of the news portals, especially when they have to rely on, many of these news portals have to rely on funding from sources which are not entirely transparent, for example, political or business interests. No? Do these news portals have to also serve a certain agenda, the agenda of their funders, depending on this, on the actual sources of funding? Okay, over to you, Himanshu.
Okay, it's very interesting. It's very interesting that you mentioned about funding. You know, where I started my career in traditional newsprint media. I started off with the Star, doing some stringing articles way back in 1992. Of course, websites did not exist at that time, or rather they were not very popular at that time. But it was only many years later, in 2013, that I made my foray into online media. And that was with an initiative from the Edge. It was called fz.com. I don't know if you remember fz.com. And it was my first experience doing online news media. You know, you might think that traditionally the costs of online news media are very much more affordable for organizations rather than the traditional newspapers and news magazines that are printed. After all, you don't need newsprint. You know, you don't need printing equipment. You don't need to pay for papers. You don't need circulation crews by the hundreds to go around circulating the copies around the whole country. But that's not completely true. You know, the equipment, the infrastructure, the talents, and the costs are extremely high, especially when you have a dedicated organization that with a lot of reporters, a lot of sections, and you have to make a lot of payments. Therefore, you are beholden to your financiers. Let me give you something that happened at fz.com way back in 2013. The Edge wanted fz.com to also operate as a newspaper, you know. So we were operating a website, and despite weaknesses in branding and weaknesses in the way in which it was attracting the readers, you know, through the various apparatus online, it was doing quite well. The quality of the articles were very good. We enjoyed a tremendous amount of freedom, a tremendous amount. I got to give it to the age, However, sometime in August 2013, the Home Ministry mysteriously, after having given us the permit to operate, revoked the permit, saying that it was deferred indefinitely, And the parliamentary excuse given by the Home Minister at that time was that we tended to carry sensational and controversial news, So our permit had to be taken away, just like that.
fc.com, is it?
fc.com, yeah. So, it's like switching on and off a switch,
Did you actually have to have a permit for online portal?
Well, online portal, but we had also applied for newspaper permit. Yeah. So even I'll come to the online portal permits afterwards. I'll explain that to you in a while. So that was followed a year later with the Malaysian Insider. Yeah. Not only it wasn't about its permit being denied or not being renewed. The link, or rather, the entire website was banned. That means they had blocked access from public users in Malaysia to Malaysian Insider. I think you might remember this was in 2014.
Yeah.
So the whole website, after with all the costs, bandwidth, network, server costs, office space rental, you're hiring about 20-30 staff, 20-30 reporters and photographers with all the equipment and all that. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, someone in the government just switches off, the switching. You're completely inaccessible. Now, so I had experienced this firsthand. Now this is also related to your question, Anil. Media, when you are operating as an online media, everyone applies for a license, So and in the license that we get, okay, this is what is. Let me read it. So this is what we get. We get a permit, which is under the Information Department, that comes under the ambit of the Ministry of Communications and Multimedia. Of course, that's the minister is Saifuddin Abdullah at the present moment. And once they give you a permit, they will emphasize then it is able to be withdrawn. Boleh ditarik balik. Kementerian ataupun jabatan boleh menarik balik kelulusan sekiranya organisasi tidak mendapati prosedur, whatever the procedure is, and serta melanggar etika kewartawanan. That means if you infringe on journalistic ethics, the ministry, the department, can judge you and therefore remove your permit. Without a permit, you can't operate and do a lot of things. You can't go to police station, go for police coverage, without the media tag. You can't go to Putrajaya, to the various ministries. There are a lot of official assignments that you cannot go to. On top of the fact that to operate as a media organization, you are now required to register, with the ministry. So this adds a lot of complications. It's very interesting because when fz.com was denied the permit was deferred or revoked, speculations were rife. And according to The Age, there were actually competitors in the media scene who were influential in the ministry's decision. I don't know how far this is true, but this is according to reports. So you can see how insidious this is. It is not just a governmental decision or a political decision. There are also other influences that affect the operations of the media, and that include corporate interference. It can be external or it can be internal among your own corporation. So whether you are now in the print media or in the online media, in Malaysian scenario, makes no difference. You are always on your guard, despite all the work that you do, all the efforts that you can make, all of a sudden the switch can just be put off, putting you in a limbo. You see, and the costs are not easy to sustain. It should be noted that bloggers can do well, but when it comes to news organizations, the costs are intensely high. Not only that, you are competing against each other. You know, it's I'm very intrigued by the fact that in media organizations that such as the one that I've operated in, we are always on the alert simply because the news is online and it is now. It is not like in the olden days, you know, that you cover the news in the afternoon and at night it goes into print, and in the morning everybody, oh, this happened, you know. It doesn't. Nowadays people know the news even before the reporters are aware of it, you know, because it's online, it's on social media. And mind you, boosting your news stories on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, etc., is not cheap. You know, there is a special mechanism to put them in the search engine. It requires expertise. This expertise does not come cheap. You see, so as Mustafa said, it becomes a lot more complicated when you are forced to censor yourself. You are forced to censor yourself because you are beholden to your organizations, your finances, and so on and so forth. You see, other than that, of course, governmental interference is always there. You know? But the governmental interference, a lot of times, is not direct. It can be indirect. How do they do it? You know, in many organizations, there are corporate proxies who are put into the organizations to basically, you know, tell you what you can run and what you cannot run. You know, this is very true in print media today, but increasingly the tendency is coming into online media as well. So, for example, you know, you put up a story, and then everybody jumps among the directors. You know, and the directors comprise of Dato Sri, Tan Sris, you know, who are basically through pressure or some other means are put there. You know, and suddenly in 10 minutes you can actually see changes being made if you're observant enough to paragraphs, you know, in your story. And in worst case scenarios, the entire story is disappears, you know, and then it comes back again completely rewritten in a very golden way, you know, that suits. And this is a reality that is happening even in online media circles. One more very interesting notion, thing that you might not have noticed is the influence of advertisers. You might think that, oh, we are free of it. No, we're not. Because of the constraint, because of the pressure of income, not only profits, income just to sustain yourself, you know, media organizations become beholden to advertisers. And I can tell you, you'll be surprised how much influence these advertisers hold, you know. Whether you're a rubber glove company, you know, or you're a company in which has been raided, you know, by the Human Resources Ministry because of the poor upkeep of your foreign laborers, you know, and suddenly the next day you can find the way in which stories are sanitized, you know, because they have to appease to the advertisers, you see. So, and the advertisers point a lot of money in, and they manage to control the narrative, you know, the narrative of the online media. So to wrap up, there is political interference, there is corporate interference. I have a lot of things to say, you know, but you know, pressure of time, you know, I can even tell you instances in which we had a minister coming in because we had written an article on a particular constituency, and we had focused on a constituent who was coming to from the opposition, who was coming to contest against the minister who was the parliamentarian at that time. And because of the space that we gave to this opposition figure, who's a very senior figure, mind you, you know, there was a chairman at the top. They blew the top because that chairman got pressure from the minister, you know? And in the end, we had to appease the minister by writing multiple reports, you know, on his work in the constituency. So this is just one example, but the most insidious thing is that on online media, instead, unlike print media, where the next day you can run clarifications or you can do other things, in the online media, the interference is direct. It is now. Whatever you print now can be changed or amended or even removed, in the blink of an eye. So these are the things that influence online. And just Anil, just before I close off, I just want to make a note. This kind of situation is not just in Malaysia; it's all over the world. Let me tell you that BBC, Guardian. You think these guys are so free? We in the editorial desk, we know when we look at reports, the way they write the backgrounders and all that, but a lot of it is so biased, and a lot of the alternative voices are not coming down, or they are being hidden, buried within articles. So this is an endemic dilemma that is facing the journalistic fraternity, not just in Malaysia, the region, or it's a global phenomenon. Right.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting, Himanshu. We'll come back to you. There's already a question raised about the Malaysia Kini case, so we'll come back to that later. Our third speaker is Dr. No Xiaoxi. She's a senior lecturer in communications with USM. Her PhD was in cinema studies from La Trobe University, Australia, and she was published on feminism and cinema and on multiculturalism in Malaysian screen culture. She's also a new Aliran member. Xiaoxi, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me, Anil?
Yeah, just to kick off the discussion. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, just now, Himanshu was talking about other outside interests coming into play in the media, including the online media, and he talked about advertising and all that. But there's also electoral influence in the media, I believe, given that, and especially now, given that the general election is looming. How independent are media in this sense, especially through the influence of big tech firms and social media giants? And we know that there are all kinds of algorithms and analytics which people can use to target messaging to certain demographics and to influence the way they think. And we've seen this being used even in Malaysia to a early extent in the last election, how politicians were able to target their messaging to certain voting groups. So just wondering, will such spending by vested political, business, and even electoral interests, how will it compromise our media, especially the freedom of the media and the independence of the media? Because people look to the media to get informed opinions about who to vote for and to come to their own political conclusions and all that. Huh? So perhaps you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, thank you, Anil. Yeah, not so long ago, we were made known that Facebook, right, sold its user personal data to the controversial Cambridge Analytica, right, for the psychometric profiling and with targeted political advertisement to influence election results throughout the world. Quite a number of countries are actually affected by this particular companies. Yeah. And according to the file leaked by the former Cambridge Analytica business development director, Brittany Kaiser, the firm was allegedly pitched a proposal to UMNO too, in the GE40, leading up to the GE40, trying to influence the voting of the 40 parliamentary constituency in Malaysia. So in the coming election, right, if we are looking at the bigger picture of of the ecosystem there, nothing much has changed. In fact, if it has changed, it's changed to the worse. So will our behavioral data collected, owned by the US-based tech giant, be sold to another company and used for political purposes again? If yes, in what form? In what kind of creative way? So these are all questions that need to be answered, not only by us, but I think by the big tech giant themselves. Yeah, like what Himanshu has said. I think it's very important for us to kind of like have a perspective that, you know, the advertising ecosystem in news media is not just the local atmosphere, you know, it is a bigger global advertising kind of like atmosphere that I'm going to talk about a little bit. So let me share my my slide. Can you all see my slide here?
Yes, yes, yes.
Right, thanks. So in fact, media freedom has deteriorated around the world over the past decades. And we have heard a lot of examples where, you know, governments' use of digital information technology to surveil, to repress, and also to punish the citizen, and also to punish their media practitioners. However, new form of manipulation and repression, right, are not only taking place in authoritarian fashion, but they are also in the name of market opportunity. Thanks to the advancements of artificial intelligence, human behavior data set has become extremely valuable, which also make make the US-based big tech company like Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft become more monopoly in terms of global market share. Platforms, products, services developed by these big tech giants not only play a key role as the primary digital intermediaries for Malaysian public, but most importantly, these profit-oriented firms are increasingly dominating our lives. Yeah. So the statistic released by Malaysian, Communication and Multimedia, MCMC, has shown that more than 70% of Malaysian internet users in Malaysia spend more than 5 hours a day on the internet in year 2020. And among these users, more than 90% are using Facebook and Google's platform. And that was a lot of hours that have been spent on this platform. In other words, enormous digital behavioral data have been generated by Malaysian internet users, which we can call that is part of our digital labors. So, and what does all this mean to media independence in Malaysia? Let me borrow the notion of surveillance capitalism to explain some problems that are facing us today. Yeah. The Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff argues that behavioral surplus is a new logic of accumulation on top of the established law of industrial capitalism. According to her, during the earliest era of internet, where Himanshu was mentioned, you know, they used to enjoy tremendous amount of freedom. That was the time, 8-9 years ago. Behavioral data were mainly collected to be reinvested in the improvement of the products or the services. However, in the era of AI, artificial intelligence, the behavioral value is mainly harvested through machine intelligence, not only to project into the future, but also to create the future that based on behavioral prediction for profit. So as we can see in this, you know, in this whatever graph that I'm trying to make here, the classical problem created by industry capitalism, such as monopoly, short-termism, inequality, economic instability, and over-materialism, are still very much persist in contemporary digital capitalism. But on top of that, we face a new form of exploitation, which is behavioral surplus. This is an unprecedented lucrative business where behavioral surplus, data science, material infrastructure, computational power, algorithmic system, as well as automated platforms are converged and translate into trillions of dollars of market capitalization. So, and you know, this is the typical kind of like global ecosystem where the Malaysian local news portal has to be operated within. And I think what Himanshu has just, you know, described and also kind of like painted for us is actually something totally different from what Larry Page, as well as Mark Zuckerberg have told us that, you know, the technology or artificial intelligence is here to provide solution. I think they are here, yes, to a certain extent provide solution, but at the same time, they are creating more problem for us. Yeah. First and foremost, if you look at the impact of this big tech domination in terms of the online advertising, the the so-called financial sustainability of the local news ecosystem has pretty much been ripped off and left with crumbs. Because if you ask any local news portals, none of them can survive based on Google ads. None. In fact, you get very marginal, money from that monetization from the Google ads. Yeah. So this is, but at the same time, like what he mentions that the cost of running an online news portal, to produce all this quality news is very costly. So who's going to pay for all this, right? Over the years, right? So the local news portal, particularly the alternatives one, they have been struggling to survive financially and to a certain extent to stay independent, and to the very least, some of them have to stay professional, just to be professional. Yeah. So to a large extent, they are also forced to kowtow to this, what Zuboff would call instrumentarian power of the big tech giants and subject to exploitation. The kind of exploitation we heard very briefly from Himanshu is that, there's this whole new ball game, how to boost your readership by paying a lot of advertisement just to boost it. And these are all the rules that has been set by this big company. And you have to play along with their rules. So to a certain extent, clickbait journalism, maximization of click by encroaching into individual behavioral surplus, forcing users to trade in their personal data to enable content targeted advertisement, and the list goes on. So in the short term, these advertising services and products seem to provide solution to the local platform. But in long run, they create dependency while extracting as much as behavioral surplus as possible from the so-called digital labors of our time and crack into our humans' life. So if these tech giants can make discrimination look like solution, then what might it have in store for us, for our democracy? So the question would be, what can be done? What can we do to regulate this big tech company who owns our psychometric profiles and behavioral surplus? So the Australian, one fantastic example would be the Australian government recently, how they, the government should act to address the imbalance of power between the big tech giants versus the local media publisher, right? So the Australian government just passed a world first law, namely News Media Bargaining Code, making the US tech giants like Google and Facebook to pay to the local news publisher to give them more leverage. So this law is also forcing the US tech monopolies to inform the local news platform of changes to their algorithms when it comes to, what kind of advertisement to be displayed on their platform. So this law, however, is not perfect, but it is the very first step that for us to push for more algorithmic transparency from this big giant. So instead of suppressing, I just like to suggest to the Malaysian government and whoever the governments are, instead of suppressing domestic freedom of expression, government from the region actually should work together and start initiating negotiation with the big tech giants in redistributing the behavioral surplus that is being generated by the global citizens like us. That's all from me, Anya.
Thank you very much, Sushi. Yeah, so you've seen all the different influences in affecting the media. And it's quite different from what it was in the past. As Xiaoxi pointed out, the mainstream media in the past, they had their own problems, but got additional new problems now. Our final speaker will be Professor Zarom Nain. He's a professor of media and communication studies at University Nottingham, Malaysia, with a background in mainly in political economy and media sociology. He's been a long-time Aliran exco member, and he's also chair of the Malaysian academic movement, also known as GERAK. He, like Mustafa, he taught at USM for more than 2 decades, and he's also been acting as consultants for various UN agencies as well. So, Rome, you've got all these interesting issues here that have been raised by the earlier speakers. So, as you can see, some might think we are spoiled for choice with so many news portals and all the proliferation of various media, which might suggest a flowering of democracy, but as Himanshu pointed out, that is only on the surface because we have all these other pressures, whether external or internal, coming in. No? And recently, the Malaysia Kini case, which also KJ John has mentioned, we saw people rallying to raise RM500,000 in a few hours. So it tells us something about what Malaysians are looking for as well, but in the case of media freedom. No? But I think a big part of the problem also is when you see so many news portals around, I myself have the problem of trying to figure out who actually owns these websites and what are their agendas, or who is funding them, and are they promoting a certain political party or politician? We don't know all this. And this is quite different from the past, where when you had the old mainstream print and broadcast media, we basically knew who we were dealing with, which political party was behind it, and which business interest was behind it. And now it's social, what Xiaoxi has pointed out, all these other behavioral studies coming in, and analytical data, artificial intelligence. So on the surface, it might look like we have freedom, but then we don't know who are the hidden parties behind all this, and what kind of messages they are targeting at people at different demographics and all that. No? And so you have studied media ownership over the years. Has transparency actually improved in terms of who is owning all these media organizations and who's behind it, or has it become more opaque?
Thanks, Daniel. So many questions, so little time. Okay, I'll try to address the key questions, I guess, there. So let me start by addressing this flowering of democracy idea or assertion, perhaps in a roundabout way, and in the process, look at the questions of media ownership, control, and transparency. Yeah? The old and new media, I call them the old and new media. I guess many people do call them the same, use the same terms in a very simple way. The old and new media in Malaysia, as elsewhere, do not exist in a vacuum. This should be the main takeaway from this discussion thus far. Yeah, all three previous speakers essentially state that, yeah, or imply, or essentially illustrate that media do not exist in a vacuum. And I can only stress the importance of this understanding. Yeah, indeed, media institutions, professionals, practices, and audiences are part of and often are influenced by wider factors, and the key factors being power structures and relations. These power relations and structures harvest groups such as the political brokers that Mustafa talks about, and the corporate proxies that Himanshu talked about earlier as well. So so after these three very exhaustive presentations tonight, exhaustive and not exhausting, exhaustive presentations, I feel there's really not much that I can add except for a couple of points to tie up the package that have been so eloquently provided by the three speakers, yeah, by my three fellow panelists. First, there has indeed been a proliferation of various media over the past 10 years, largely due to the digitalization of the media and the widespread use of the internet. Yeah. But proliferation isn't necessarily a good thing. Yeah. Indeed, the proliferation of some media types, principally digital media, has adversely affected other older media, yeah, such as the print media. Circulation of many newspapers have dropped around the world. Some due, of course, to trust issues. In the context of Malaysia, certainly trust issues, but others due to economics and changing reading patterns, readership patterns. So in the first place, while new developments have resulted in media proliferation, increasing quantity does not necessarily mean an increase in quality. Many years ago, two wise media scholars from the UK, Peter Golding and Graham Murdoch, wrote critically about the proliferation of television programs around the world and warned us that this actually amounted to the proliferation of much of a muchness, more of the same. In contemporary Malaysia, there is this danger of the danger of this being the case. Indeed, for many years, the increase in media channels and even products, by and large, meant the increase in the production and dissemination of the same perspectives and points of view. Mainly at that point in time, the BN perspective or the UMNO perspective or points of view at that point in time. So until, for example, the emergence of Malaysia Kini in 1999 as our first independent news portal, all this was until freely available to everyone who had internet access. Malaysians were very much dependent on the mainstream Malaysian media. Whatever the doubts about the setting up of the Multimedia Super Corridor or the MSC in 1996, the Bill of Guarantees then that assured the freedom of the internet in many ways allowed Stephen Gunn and company to set up Kini without much harassment from the regime. Of course, they have been harassed many times since and even brought to court, culminating most recently, as you mentioned, in the sentencing and penalty imposed by the federal court. Right? We can talk about that a bit later. Digitalization has also resulted in Malaysians who have internet connectivity being able to access international news media, such as the BBC and CNN and even The Guardian. So it could be argued that digitalization has brought about genuine variety. But I would advise caution given the legal and economic controls this regime has over media institutions and activities, indeed over society as a whole, under this present so-called emergency. The Communications and Multimedia Act, for example, of 1998 was enacted, I would suggest, for such a purpose. And so was the MCMC, or the Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission, charged, to quote what it says, charged with overseeing the new regulatory framework for the converging telecommunications and broadcasting industries and online activities. So both the Act and the Commission are what could half in jest be called the big brother of the digital age. Then, of course, there is a market. Like it or not, the Malaysian economy is very much tied up to the dominant neoliberal international system, with companies obliged to having business models that privilege profits over everything else. As far as the media are concerned, such a system tends to emphasize the frivolous over facts, sensationalism over analysis, form over substance, and of course, quantity over quality. We're clearly heading that way with our media, old and new, as they struggle to survive economic pressures and navigate political control. So to get back to the beginning of this long first point, there's been a proliferation of various media over the past 10 years, largely due to the digitalization of the media and the widespread use of the internet. But the nature and quality of this proliferation need to be critically evaluated. And such evaluation must take into account the impact of political and economic changes. In Malaysia, we need to look at the dark GE14 era, through to the hope generated for 2+ years after GE14, and the despair that followed the 2020 Sheraton move and coup, which resulted in the backdoor government we have now. And also, we have to consider the global pandemic that happened at virtually the same time. So we must appreciate the cycle of changes in order to come up with alternative game plans. So any analysis of media futures, I believe, needs to appreciate the societal realities and the exercise of power in Malaysian society. So it is clearly important that we locate ownership and control patterns of the media within this wider exercise of power. As it stands with the old media, while getting such information was not exactly straightforward, nonetheless, information could be pieced together from various sources to come up with a composite picture of ownership patterns and so on and so forth. But the new media and even social media present, like you say, new challenges. Who really control and bankroll many of these organizations still remain a secret for many, especially in the security-obsessed country of ours. New transparency laws need to be enacted. But of course, wishing for it is not going to make it happen. Therein lies one major impediment of an authoritarian society like ours. But what studies have shown is that if the dominant system of governance is undemocratic, it is unlikely that the media industries as a whole will be democratic and representative. And by and large, you can't have a free media when there is little or no freedom of expression. At the present moment, some online media in Malaysia appear to test the boundaries. But recent developments, as I will allude to in the next section, point to attempts at curbing such testing. So the second related and final point I can make in this time-restricted presentation is this. There is this suggestion that state and economic ownership and control shouldn't be our focus. It is the digital media, it is asserted, and the companies concerned that are now in control with their algorithms, etc. But surely these companies are operating based on the logic of capitalism. Hence, I and my fellow presenters here have indicated that the imperatives of the economic system, what Dan Schiller has called digital capitalism, impinge on the way media, old and new, operate and will continue to operate. So of course, we need to stress the importance of ownership and control, certainly in the context of contemporary Malaysia. And we also need to interrogate the changes in the political environment in Malaysia since March 2020. Changes indeed are being pursued by those in power under the cloak of the emergency to control expression and subsequently the media environment. Exactly a week ago, for example, on March 11th, the government published in the Gazette the Emergency Essential Powers No. 2 Ordinance. The focus of this ordinance is specifically on fake news in relation to COVID-19 and the proclamation of emergency. It came into force the next day on March 12th. In this regard, I close with the scary comments of Andrew Koo, who's co-chair of the Bar Council Constitutional Law Committee, in his Malaysia Kini article titled, "The Fake News Ordinance is More Draconian Than We Think." And I quote him, "Section 24 of the Fake News Ordinance compels an accused person to set out a defense statement stating in general terms the nature of his or her defense and the areas of dispute with the prosecution case. The accused person must also produce copies of any document which would be tendered as part of the defense. In other words, a person charged with an offense under the ordinance has to disclose what his or her defense is even before the prosecution has actually proven that there is a case to be answered. This severely weakens the position of the accused person and places the accused person in a very unfair position vis-a-vis the prosecution. To summarize, the Fake News Ordinance is a much more draconian piece of law than we appreciate. It represents a steamrolling of due process rights and fair trial protections and is a gross violation of human rights and fundamental liberties as provided in the federal constitution and law," unquote. New media or old media, nothing revolutionary is going to take place if we don't address, critique, and overturn undemocratic actions and policies that are currently being implemented. Easier said than done, perhaps you might say, but genuine social change that is liberating seldom is easy and without cost. The alternative, of course, is burying our heads in the sand and hoping somehow that all this will go away. But it won't with our inaction. It is about our agency, not the novelty of new media or the purported objectivity or accuracy of the old. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rome. You kept time very well. Yeah, I'm sure you had plenty more to say, and I think a lot of questions will come up on the floor. First, we move on to the questions. Henry has raised a question. Can any of the speakers let us know where do young people, say those between 18 to 40 years, get their news and keep abreast with what's going on, say, in the country and around the world? They wouldn't be relying on print media, right? I think Xiaoxi did hint about where they get their sources of news from through the statistics on social media, Facebook and Instagram. Huh?
Yeah, Anil, that's just how much time they spend on the platform, not really access to news. Yeah, I don't have the figure now, but then I remember it a lot. Well, you know, when we were teaching with hundreds of students, usually we ask them, where do you usually get your news? Those are the, you know, students in their 20s. They usually will tell you that they will just get their news through their social media platform. Like
Yeah,
this.
I remember asking the students at USM that, and
Yeah,
that's
what
most of
we
them said
usually do.
Facebook. At that time, I think at that time they didn't have Instagram.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So this is also, I guess, part of the worries where, you know, the social media platform has been, you know, actively calculate everything that we are watching every minute, right? So they keep feeding you something, you know, the echo chambers and whatnot. They keep feeding you something that they think you like, and you will stay on to read and to click in. So that's how the echo chambers, and you see all this so-called far right movement is becoming, you know, more prominent than before. Yeah.
yeah, and I think they also know what kind of news you like to read, and then they feed you similar news, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. We got a question from Frida from Wisdom Foundation. Since the issue of media being dependent on certain channels, thus altering the narration of news, is an endemic condition, what can Malaysia learn from other countries which have been more successful in ensuring freedom of expression? Anybody would like to take that question? What can Malaysia learn from other countries who have been more successful? Is there any country which has been successful in ensuring freedom of expression?
To answer your question, I think it's a matter of degree. Yeah, that there are certainly more open countries around that have a higher level of freedom of expression. Yeah, but yeah, to answer your question, yeah.
Yeah, but then as we have seen also, that also comes with risks, inherent risks, the emergence of xenophobic, right-wing views, extremist rhetoric. We also saw that in Malaysia. I mean, on social media, which was quite free, and when we had the COVID lockdowns, there's a tendency to blame the migrant workers, and I think that was also fueled by social media.
The nature of the digital media these days, and 24-hour media as well, and so the way that social media has been expanding, I think to think about controls is quite quite short term, and it's quite impossible in many ways. What is more important, I feel, is and it probably will have to happen in the long run. It certainly will have to happen in the long run. Will be media literacy. Yeah, there is a need for greater media literacy among the public, not only in Malaysia but around the world as well. Yeah, I stated elsewhere that the genie is out of the bottle. Now you can't put the genie back in the bottle somehow. You know, with this idea of 24-hour news, or the practice of 24-hour news, and so on and so forth. So it's virtually impossible to control it. I mean, as far as news organizations are concerned, one panel discussion we had a year ago, one of the top editors there said, you know, we just don't have the manpower, human power to do this. We don't, you know, to counter 24 hours. That's not possible, given the problems with the economy and with the problems of running the newspaper or the news portal. Yeah. So if you can't do that, then you know there must be some other way of we have to think about, and it's essentially, for some of us at least, certainly for me, it requires increasing the literacy of people at different levels, yeah, in formal and informal kind of situations. Okay, thanks.
So Lee Yudin says if there's freedom, the media will end up being biased. Like in America, almost all of the major news outlets became left-wing. Well, I mean,
sorry, but I think she's been watching too much Fox News. I mean, the idea of left-wing biases, you know, if you want to call CNN left-wing, I think that there is a need to re-question our notion of what left-wing is, yeah, and not fall into the trap of what the people at Fox News says, yeah. So there's the extreme right-wing nature of Fox News and others, I think are more dangerous in that kind of sense, yeah.
And perhaps related to that is the whole issue of fake news in the climate of free expression and all that. What actually constitutes fake news and who decides what is fake news? Frida has a follow-up question. What about in the UK as well as Canada and Australia, as was shown in the earlier presentation? Or was it referring to another type of information? So fake news, I mean, could you elaborate a bit more on what we are facing now in Malaysia with this fake news thing? And how does it compare with what's happening in the US, or what we saw in the Trump administration? Is it really a problem in Malaysia, this fake news thing?
Can I quickly say something? Sorry, I don't mean to dominate. It's just
carry on.
Because I'm obsessed with the idea of fake news. The fake news thing right now seems to be an invention of the present regime, essentially. Yeah, the anti-fake news law was repealed under the PH government. It's not been brought back, but under this ordinance, you know, we're having definitions of fake news which are quite what's the word for it? Quite nasty, yeah. And I think these are definitions provided by the official stand, as it were, and definitions that have not been debated in Parliament, because we don't have debates in Parliament at the present moment in time. So if you want to ask me what's the current situation of fake news and who defines it, the current situation of fake news, you just read what the government ordinance is all about, and the emergency ordinance is all about, because it's boldly defined there, and you know, it's such a wide spectrum of controls that's there. So it's a very dangerous development, yeah, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, someone else.
And Antio writes, I think he's worried about the fake news bill, or the fake news ordinance. What happens when messages are deleted or appear in closed groups? Can screenshots be used as evidence? I guess nobody really knows how it's going to be enforced, no, this fake news ordinance.
Well, if you follow what happened with Malaysia Kini, right, and what happened then, I think they will be used. Screenshots can be used and will probably be used by the regime.
Even in closed groups. Malaysia Kini is an open platform. Yeah, you can never know. You can never know how it's going to be.
I suppose it depends on. Sorry.
Yeah, carry on, Moose.
No, I suppose it also depends on the kind of conversation you have in the group, and what kind of topics, what kind of topics you have for discussion, you know.
And how big the group is as well, huh?
Yeah. If it is, I suppose, if it is a conversation that's quite critical of the government, I suppose they are quite a likely target. I mean, as it is, you don't know what fake news is, really. It's up to them to define, right?
Yeah. Lim Jingji raises the question, is the US a prime example of freedom of expression in a nation where media censorship does not exist? If so, is it possible for Malaysia to also follow the footsteps of the US? Would you like to address that question? And then Irfan Daniel says, somehow too much of freedom of expression doesn't seem like a good idea.
I would like to address the question of the US media.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess most of the, you know, if you follow the US, some of the reporting in the US is super, how do you call that, commercial. Yeah, regardless of whether they are right wing or left wing, they are super commercial. I guess that's the environment of the neoliberalist kind of like environment that is actually how the media is operating, which is very different from Malaysia, where we have very strong control from the government. Yeah. But that one you have invisible hands, which is the commercial control, which is looks like you have a lot of freedom, but the kind of freedom has always been shaped by the powerful, but the powerful might not be a visible powerful that who operate within. Well, I don't want to sound too much like a what do you call that speculation here, but I guess if you read Robert McChesney, I guess he's done a very well research on how the neoliberal ideology has been encouraged into the media industry in the US.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess there's in the US media. I mean, it might appear free to outsiders. It might look like a place where there's a lot of freedom of expression, but I think there are a lot of other views which are also being marginalized in the mainstream media in the US, especially questions related to poverty, middle class poverty, workers' rights.
Yeah.
Some of the large corporations in the US, I mean, they've got
Especially the
poor track
unions.
records on workers' rights.
I don't get to read a lot of the unions news.
Yeah,
On the
yeah,
unions. Yeah.
union news as well. And then also there's little criticism of their foreign adventures, for example, in the mainstream media, especially military interventions all over the place. Irfan says there's somehow too much freedom of freedom of expression doesn't seem like a good idea. What's your take on that, Himanshu?
Well, even readers and commentators from the public need to exercise due caution, both in terms of making sure that they don't vilify excessively or criticize excessively, unduly any other personality or party being given the platform of the online media. So I know for a fact that some of the web portals that are operating around, news portals that are operating right now, they actually assign editors to watch over readers' comments all the time, because many of the readers use excessively abusive language and so on and so forth. And of course, racism, ethnic, degrading others ethnically or because of their political viewpoints and all that. Now, in the Malaysia Kini issue, when it went to the courts, the readers' comments were taken into account, and these were for the questioning or rather criticizing court decisions, So readers also, the public also, needs to exercise conscientious commentating. Internet is free, it's open, but that does not mean that you overstep the freedom that is given to you. So it works both ways. But of course, overarchingly, in the grander scheme of things, the authoritarian control via direct governmental means or by corporate influence is still the biggest worry.
But one of the things about the US media as well as other global news media is that they do not have many of them do not have readers' comments, maybe precisely because of this problem. Other than maybe the sports section they might have, but not the main news items. Perhaps also because of this, the slant, and they feel that the readers' comments could embarrass their editorial positions. But also in Malaysia, there was an argument that people have been suppressed for so long, like over 4 decades, when they suddenly had this freedom on the internet to express themselves, whether, especially anonymously, Many of them just poured out how they felt without actually thinking the consequences. So would media literacy help in that respect? Being taught how to use some decorum in commenting, or what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Decorum and responsibility, in how you comment or address other people and parties on social media and the internet. Yeah.
So Frida says, always a yin and yang to everything. We can say everything, but to a certain limit, always a balance, which I think, that would also be a good approach, maybe. Mary Magdalene asks, so is it all doom and gloom now, or are there any rays of light which give some hope for media freedom? Do you see anything positive in the state of media in Malaysia right now? Any of the speakers? Moose?
Where's the question? Huh?
Do you say anything? It seems like it's all doom and gloom as far as media freedom in Malaysia is concerned. Do you see anything positive in recent months and the last few years?
I think there is still freedom, but like I said, one has to be vigilant. Well, not one, but we have to be vigilant about attempts to further curb the freedom that we have. I concur with what Rome said earlier on, that media literacy is important to many of us. I mean, to people who read the website, the newspapers, and all that, because there's a need of some kind of an etiquette. You have to have that. I suppose in some ways, like you said, all along all these years, there's so much suppressed feeling that the moment you get the internet, you just let it out. Yeah. And also, I think I would call a syndrome of surat layang, because those days you just lash it out through your surat layang without much control of yourself, and this is I suppose a manifestation of that kind of surat layang, especially when you use anonymous name, a different name. I would rather that whether it's news portals or print media, to actually encourage people to write letters, and put your name there, letters to the editor. I think the West, or at least the people in the West, some of them appreciate the value of you putting your name there, and be responsible for what you write, as opposed to just hiding behind some other names. It doesn't add value, actually. I mean, especially if we have some bigoted opinions, as opposed to having a real dialogue with your names there, so that you can interact and can be instructive for other readers, to see the two sides of the argument, of the controversy.
Yeah, so that's an idea. And I think that if you look at the media from a broader perspective, like one of the bright things which happened on the digital media was last year's digital parliament, where you got the young people online. No? Of course, that looking at media in its broader sense, but the medium the new media just offer more space for other views which are not normally heard. The question for Himanshu. Earlier you mentioned that online media are facing pressures from advertisers. Would a subscription fee like practiced by Malaysia Kini help, or are they susceptible to advertising pressures as well? I can't hear you, Himanshu. You unmute.
Unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I am not sure what model exactly they're using in their financing, but they are also international bodies that are giving grants, for media organizations, especially those involved in civil liberties, free speech, and so on and so forth, and special issues. But generally, for all media, advertising is absolutely imperative, unless you are having generous donors and massive grants. If you're not, advertising is absolutely, and thereby inevitably, to a larger or lesser extent, each media organization becomes beholden to a corporate entity. Yeah.
Yeah, but also increasingly we're seeing media, prominent media outside the country going subscription-based. The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a few others.
Yeah. Well, I think these organizations, these media organizations are big enough. They already have a huge readership base, through which they are able to draw advertisers. Because media organizations have to show, how many hits they are getting, page per views. I mean, there's a whole analytics behind this to convince advertisers to place their ads. So, I mean, an organization like New York Times, I'm sure they are, but it's still an uphill battle, for websites to operate without advertising.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions asking about the new media. Given that all these constraints in the print and even on the online media, and Theo asks, is there a new definition of what media is today? Anyone can broadcast on his or her own social media, and the definition of news versus information. Does information become news when one shouts it via social media? Must one have a minimum number of audience? And then Frida takes it a step further from Anne's question. If licensed news media are now more influenced due to various factors, independent people, the new voice of truth, where do we get the honest news now? Rome?
About news, I read Anne's and Frida's comments, questions. This whole notion, I think we have this perception that news is somehow, there is some objective truth out there somehow, and news must get that objective truth. This notion of trawling, random trawling for news effectively. But in real life, I feel that's not been the case. Study after study has shown that news are manufactured. Yeah, news are produced in many ways. Yeah, and they're produced again in terms of what is more important and what is less important, based on various structures in society. Yeah, who dominates those structures? Yeah, I mean, how much do we know, for example, as far as the pandemic and people who are suffering? How much do we hear from the migrant workers, for example, as opposed to people talking about those migrant workers being in the news? That's just one example. Some voices are deliberately marginalized or pushed aside, and others are amplified. So I think once we start from that understanding that news itself is essentially created, yeah, out of in a kind of structural contents based on the structures in society, then we begin to understand perhaps why certain news dominate, certain perspectives dominate, and others don't. Yeah, so I think we've got to get rid of this myth surrounding the fact that journalists are randomly selecting, for news around the world. Yeah, I think that's a myth that's strong. A myth. That's a myth about Father Christmas. Yeah, so Santa Claus. So I think we have to be a little bit more circumspect about what we see as news. And yeah, and there's notions of the truth as well. I mean, again, it's problematic. Yeah, and to get back quickly to what Erwan said earlier, that maybe you have too much freedom of expression. The question is, who's going to determine how much freedom of expression that is there? And that's very problematic. Yeah, if you're going to say there's too much freedom of expression, then you're essentially taking a stand, and often the people who are going to determine how much or how little freedom of expression you have are going to be those in power. So I think we have to be careful about essentially legitimizing the control that these people are just waiting to pounce on, to essentially, to use, because they'll say, oh, there's too much. Yes, these people say there's too much freedom of expression, too much freedom of information as well. So, it's not good for you. That's been the myth that's constantly been generated in our country, the sensitive issues thing, that you can't handle it somehow, and therefore we control all of that. It's very, very dangerous. So that's my stand. And I think we ought to dismantle or question and start dismantling these myths, that are meant to preserve certain power structures.
So there's another question here, Anne raised, and especially in the light of what happened to Malaysia Kini. Now people are worried about what people post on their blogs and even on their social media. So she asked, what if someone posts a libelous comment on my Facebook post? Who is liable for the comment, considering what happened to Malaysia Kini? Is that news? So Xiaoxi, what do you think? What happens when there's a libelous comment on your Facebook post? Is it the responsibility of the person making the post, or the tech giant, or the person who owns the Facebook profile or page?
Well, if you ask me my stand, I certainly think it's the platform owners who are actually in the more powerful position to help control, so to speak, the control with all the technologies, and also the kind of financial, ability that they have. So if we negotiate with this big tech company with certain set of rules that can be built into their algorithm, which help to, not only help them to raise more clicks, or, not only help them to produce more, profit, but actually help to kind of like monitor, or, the diversity of differences of opinion, and also to a certain extent control hate speech. I think if you are using all the linguistic algorithm, it's not that difficult to identify hate speech. I think linguists, they have all the experts to tell you that, there's a certain way of, identifying what are hate speech and what kind of hate speech are really not acceptable and whatnot. And we can easily get this done by using algorithm. I believe, if anyone in the world have the capacity of doing that, is the big tech company with their technology of algorithms, rather than putting the responsibility on the small platform owners, like the local media news portal, as well as individual Facebook user. I don't think the responsibility should be put on all this.
I think the problem lies because the tech giants also themselves are torn between getting more hits from all these populist extremist remarks, as well as, and also trying to moderate the discussion somehow away from extremist views. So they themselves are torn by profit motive and social responsibility. Francis says he used to start his day reading the papers in different languages every day. Then he will be ready to comment on what happened yesterday, and also comment on what the paper said too. So he'll be like one day behind. So how do you do that now, Francis?
Maybe he should change his behavior.
Yeah. I mean, it just shows that things keep changing very fast. But at the same time, there's also a problem. I mean, like with the news changing so fast, there's little time to reflect on the direction we are heading and what's actually happening in the country. And I suppose there's a need to take a distance, and also to step back and see the big picture, as you call it.
One of the biggest sufferers of the online media craze, is long-form journalism, reflective analysis, commentary with hard facts, researched evidence, and all that. Because by and large, most of the readers they read very cursorily, if I may use the word, And organizations want them to click, to make the hit. Whether they read the whole article or not, it doesn't matter, but at least they have the click, and that's the record for the organizations, you see, the media organizations. And people generally, I mean, I'm not criticizing all readers, but people generally are now lazier. The social media culture, on WhatsApp, they want to read fast. They look at the first few paragraphs where there's the clickbait and the very interesting things. And most don't delve deeper into an issue to look at the dry facts, the research and all that. So most media organizations just follow suit. Yeah.
I suppose that's also a function of media overload. People can't spend time on any particular news for too long. They just move on to the next. No? Then Francis says, then I retired. Francis says, then I retired and stopped reading any papers in any language. Relied more on online. Don't seem to miss the papers at all. And one can pick and choose online media and social media. Life seems to go on. Politics remains just as awful. Maybe the new media, if you have media literacy, suffices. Maybe if you have media literacy, it suffices. We can pick and choose. Don't need the old traditional media like the Stars or the New Straits Times or the other print media. On that note,
I'm
I think we had so I think it's 10 o'clock. We had a good discussion, and maybe sometime in the future we will come back to this. And thank you all for participating. There's a lot of gloom out there, but I think we also have to look at the positives. And I think if you compare where we are now with 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we only had the TV, the newspapers, and the radio, and we didn't hear many other views. So there is still some space compared to where we were. So it's just that we've gone backwards over the last few years, no? So Dila says, please write to us if you have anything in mind to highlight. Yeah, and you can always, if you have any other views or you'd like to write an article or two about what you think about media, just send in your articles to the Aliran website.